Yeah, you know, windy.
Hmm. Okay. I hope I have enough battery on this. All right. So I haven't started recording yet. So. All right. So it's December 31st, 19.
What?
And I'm reciting an introduction here.
Also,
It's December 31st, 2013, New Year's Eve 2014, with Waltraut Buser, Dr. Waltraut Buser, to interview her about some aspects of her life. So we start with, when and where were you born?
well, I was born October 17th, 1929 in Munich.
And your parents were?
Well, my parents were Wilhelm Heinrich and Antonie Heinrich, born Böck.
And talk a little about your childhood from
My
the early.
childhood. Well, I was the first child of three. My brother was born 2 years after, and my little sister 10 years later. And I think we had a very happy childhood. And so, first 2 years we lived in Unterhaching, which is near Munich, a small village. At that time, one of those really small villages. My brother was born there, but soon after that we moved to Munich. First we lived in an apartment in Untergiesing in the Pilgersheimer Straße. And when I was maybe 5 years or something like that, 4 or 5 years, 5 years maybe, we moved to another apartment in the Grünwalder Straße. That was a big, nice house. The owners lived on the, what you'd call the second floor. The first floor, another family lived in one part, and in the second part we lived with a door to the garden, and in the third floor another family lived. It was a rather big house, and the owners lived in between, and they had a nice big balcony. And the house survived the war, and every time I'm in Munich, you know, when I go by there in the streetcar, I always look out and look at it.
It's still there.
It's still there. It survived the war, yes, fortunately. It was a big house, and on one end of it there was a small, longish house which was rented to a single woman, to a Frau Oma. And one of my father's carpenters, Michael Moore, he had rented a room there, and she was widowed, and there was probably they had an affair. He was a single guy and she was widowed. She was very nice, Frau Oma, yeah. And we had the run of the garden. There was a big garden, you know, and a little garden house, and we had our sandbox, and it was really very nice, almost like living in your own house. And the only disturbances were we had this nice sandbox where Günther and I played. And the owners had a son who at that time, Siegfried, he was maybe 13 years old or something, and then came a little girl, Annie, and of course Annie toddled around and sometimes destroyed our sand cakes and stuff like that, you know. And one of the renters had another little girl, a little bit taller, bigger than Annie, and it was Brunhilde, and Brunhilde was in the age where she was really destructive, like maybe 3 years old, 2, 3 years old, and she used to, you know, destroy what we had carefully baked with sand and all that. So Brunhilde's coming was a cry of war.
Sounded like a terror child.
Well, I guess she was not worse than anybody else, but we did not like Brunhilde for that reason. And she was too little, you could not she was too little to play with, and of course you could not hit her or anything, you know, but Brunhilde was coming, so.
So this was near the Geiselgastagstraße.
No, it was on the Grünwalder Straße, near the Haltestelle Tiroler Platz. And as I say, the house survived the war. And we lived there several years, and I started to go to school from when we lived there.
Yeah, where did
And,
you go to school?
well, at that time it was called Hans Schem Schule. Now it's called Rot Buchen Schule. And it was in Neuharlaching, in New Harlaching, a very new section of town, you know, with relatively new houses. The church was rather new, the Heilige Familie. And the school was only maybe 2 years old or so when I started to go there. Brand new school, very modern, very clean and light, you know. And as I say, I walked about half an hour or something like that. And
Were there streetcars at the time?
huh?
Were there streetcars to go? Could you take a streetcar to school?
No. The streetcar went into the city, and the school was, you know, at a right angle, so to speak, to the streetcar line. No, there was no public transportation there. I had to walk, and there was an open, big open meadow. Later, many houses were built there, and so, but at that time there were not any houses there, and they used. And then there was a row of houses and. Along the Rotbuchenstraße. These were single-family villas, and at least one of my classmates lived there, Dulce Meckenbecher. Her parents had one of those houses, but otherwise it was still open, and there was a little hill, you know, a slope to the open space. And in the winter, when there was snow, there was rodeln, you know, sleighing and skiing going on there. But more important, there was a shepherd who still, all summer long, grazed his sheep there. He had a whole herd of sheep. And I was rather shy as a child. I did not make friends easily or, you know, talk to strangers or something. But somehow I made friends with the shepherd. We usually exchanged a few words when I saw him, when I went to school or came from school rather, and we had a few words together.
That's funny.
Yeah,
So describe sort of what school was like.
Oh well, first let me finish the shepherd. And
Sure.
one day he told me there had been a thunderstorm the day before, and he told me he had lost several sheep in the thunderstorm, struck by lightning.
Wow.
Was out in the open, you know.
And you were walking to school and...
Well, not in the thunderstorm,
Right.
Obviously. But, you know, even when it rained and in the winter when it snowed, yeah, I walked to school because there was nothing else really how to get there. And not only that, I also walked in the, or maybe that was a year later, that was a year or two later. I went once or twice a week in the afternoon because there were extra gym lessons, you know, some children's gymnastics and stuff and so, but...
Sort of after-school activity type?
No, it was in the afternoon. You had to go there. You know, in Germany you only had school in the morning. You came home any time between 12 and 1 o'clock and so, and school started in the morning, usually around 8. But afternoon school, that is in the beginning, my first school year, or maybe even the first 2 or 3 school years. I think once a week we had afternoon classes, but only for 2 hours. But usually school was in the morning and ended 12, 1 o'clock, something like that.
What time did it start?
8 o'clock usually.
8 o'clock, okay.
Mm-hmm.
And what was it a large school, small school?
No, I would say medium-sized. It had all 8 grades, you know, 1st through 8th grades, and next to the school was also a very new modern kindergarten, but I never went to kindergarten.
Mm.
Kindergarten is what nursery school is in the United States. That is kindergarten, say 1 or 2 years before school. But I guess my mother did not believe in kindergarten because we could pick up too many germs and also maybe bad habits, I don't know.
I see.
None of us went to kindergarten.
So what was school like? What were you good at?
I was actually usually good in everything. I learned to read very fast. I really wanted to learn to read. Before I went to school, I wanted to write and read, really. And I always begged either my mother or my grandmother or Tante Maria or also our cook, to draw me letters. I mean, big Latin letters, whatever, and so on. And I used to copy them. But nobody told me what they meant, So you cannot learn to read if nobody tells you what sound a letter has. And my mother, I remember that very clearly. At that time, it seems, a certain amount of children, as now also, had trouble learning to read, And it was believed that the modern method of teaching was the method. And I clearly remember that she once told our maid, whoever it was at that time, and please, do not teach Waltraut to read. It was not considered good for the methods and for the child if you learned it the wrong way. That was one of those things of modern education at that time. So nobody ever made an attempt of teaching me to read, which I could have learned very easily before school if somebody had just told me and taught me. So I had to wait till I learned it in school, and I learned it very fast.
Mm-hmm.
And after a couple of months, of course, I had read all the Lesebuch, the reading book which you have in first grade.
Mm-hmm.
I knew all the stories, I had read it all, and I was desperate for things to read. I was a real Leseratte even as a child. So that was later in the Tegelsee Landstraße, in the Grünwalder Straße. I don't remember having, well, I had some books, but there was no access really to my parents' books. I don't know where they kept them. But whenever somebody came, usually my grandmother, and took me to town, to buy something or just to visit her or whatever. Once I could read, I read everything. I read the signs on the streetcars, I read the advertisements in the shops out loud, anything I could see that could be read, I would read out loud to her because, I enjoyed reading. And I think she was sometimes embarrassed and said,
That's surprising that the culture was to keep reading from you.
Pardon me?
It's surprising that the culture was such that they kept reading from you.
I think the theory was that reading has to be taught by the proper method, because there were stories, sometimes children had trouble learning to read. It was a bad method. I don't know the real reason. But anyway, I remember that remark of my mother's, don't teach Waltraut to read, because it was believed the school professional teacher knew best how to do it.
So you found your way to find things to read, even if there were street signs.
Oh yeah. Oh yes, everything.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, and I learned to read quite fast, as I said, and reading never was a problem. I mean, school was not hard. I usually was a very good student at all.
What about math? Math, you must have been
no
good at.
problem.
Okay.
I mean, we had addition and subtraction and, of course, the Amalanes, Amalanes is 1 times 1 is 1, 1 times 2 is 2, 3 times 7 is 21. And you had to learn these things, really learn them. If the teacher said 7 times 9, you were supposed to know the answer, 63. So that was the method. That was in all schools, the same in all schools in all of Germany. And it was rote learning. That was part of the homework. You just memorized it.
And so what were some of the most memorable things from school for you?
Hmm. Most memorable
Is there
things.
anything in particular you were proud of that you accomplished?
Well, I remember that was a very modern school. I say, as I said, it was newly built. It was maybe 2 years old. It still exists. It still is a nice modern school, low building, and so separate a garderobe, a room, a gated room where you hung your coats and hats in the winter, and so, very clean and progressive. The most memorable things, yeah, every year before the school year ended. By the way, at that time the school year started after Easter and ended then before Easter. And the new school year would start after Easter. And only years later was it changed to what it is now and what it is internationally, more or less. I think that you start the new grade after the summer vacation, but not at that time when I started school. You started school after Easter.
Hmm.
And you had a Schulranzen, a lesser, whatever, which you wore on your back. Every child did, every child had that. And they looked a little bit different for boys and girls. So the boys had a full lid, so to speak, a full closure, and the girls another one which was not full, and you had your sponge and little washcloths hanging out because they were often a little bit wet, which you used to wipe your Schiefertafel, your slate.
Hmm. So you practiced writing on
Oh
a
yes.
slate, not on paper.
Oh no, that would have been a waste of good paper. I mean, later, when we could write properly and so, we also got hefty, I mean, these little copybooks with lines where we would write first with pencil and later on with pen and ink. But the first step, no, and we used the Schiefertafel, the slate. As a matter of fact, all through elementary school, I mean, up to the 4th grades, and when you entered, if you went to high school, which a minority did only, and then in high school, usually you did not write on your slate again. You only had, copybooks. But when I entered high school, that was more or less when the war started. And for reasons of saving paper and other austerities and so, we continued to use our Schiefertafel even in high school, which in peace would not have been the case. But through the war years, I still used the slate when I was in 4th grade in high school, because for all things that were not really meant to be permanent or so, and to save paper, we still used a slate and a griffle. A griffle is a pencil with which you can write on slate, which we have to sharpen every time, with a knife or a sharpener. So, and it can break, and but you could just wipe it off, And the slate had 2 sides. One side had lines, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines, so that you can balance the size of your letters when you learned it. And the other side was blank for drawing things and for math problems and stuff like that.
And going back to your elementary years, what sort of maybe family adventures did you have? Hiking, did you have at that time the Starnberg?
No, Starnberg was later. It came later. While I was in elementary school, we were in Munich. Well, we lived in a beautiful house that my father had built with a big garden. My father had this big carpentry where we had the runoff. I mean, we invaded our neighbor. Neighbor to the one side was Kurzenberger, who had who traded in wood, building woods, I mean, boards and all kinds of things, and uncut tree trunks and whatever wood. And Günther and I kind of invaded his property. was all right with him, you know, and climbed around. And of course, in our carpentry, there were stacks of all kinds of wood, sawed, unsawed, and we had, as I say, we had plenty of freedoms there. And we built our forts behind the little cabin in our garden by the swimming pool. There was a distance maybe like that between the back of that. It was just an open shed where you could leave your clothes when you went to the swimming pool. It was not a big swimming pool, maybe just a little bit longer than that room, but not as wide. And the water was always ice cold because it didn't get any sun. And you know, in Munich the weather is often cold even in summer, and it was cold Leitungswasser as it came from the tap, and it really never warmed up. And of course it was just a simple pool. It had no you know, filtration or added chemicals or anything. So in the late summer, when it really got a little bit warmer, there was usually some moss on the ground or algae forming and so. But anyway, you know, everybody used it in the family.
So you spend much of your summer in the near around this pool?
No, I mean we swam in there, yeah, sure. When the weather was good, but the weather isn't always good. And also in summer vacation it was customary for anybody who could afford it, and many people could, to go away for 2, 3, 4 weeks for a summer vacation if they went to school. So my first summer vacation we went to the Chiemsee, to a little village on the Chiemsee, and that's where I learned to swim.
Where's Chiemsee?
To the southeast of Munich, more or less. It's the biggest Bavarian lake, except for the Bodensee, which is not really Bavaria anymore. It's a really big lake, and it has an island where one of King Ludwig's castles is, Herren Chiemsee. Have you ever heard of it? Yeah.
Okay. And so you were close with Gunther, it sounds like.
Yeah, we are only 2 years apart, and we usually played together, yeah.
So you probably had adventures that your parents didn't know about.
I wouldn't necessarily say that I didn't know about, but we had the run of the place, you know. We climbed around on those stacks of wood and so on, and watched the carpenters, and of course we ran in the garden, and no, we had a good childhood.
Did you have a sense of the sort of the political developments during the 30s?
Yeah, you heard about it at home, you know, the grown-ups discussing, and you heard about it to some degree at school, of course. And you saw some of that.
But of course you're under 10 years old, so...
Yeah, at that time I was under 10 years old. And I was only 11 and a half when my father died. And that was already during the war then. But I do remember some things of the political, what was going on in the big world or in politics. Because very often my grandmother came visiting, and she lived in Schwabing, which is in the city.
This is Uroma.
That was, yeah,
Right.
Uroma, what our children would call Uroma, my grandmother. And she came often, you know, and we really loved her, and she sometimes brought news, and also my Tante Hella, who lived with her, she and my Uncle Alfred at that time still lived with my grandmother. They were both unmarried in an apartment in Schwabing. And Tante Hella frequently came too, and also Uncle Alfred. He got married just, I don't quite know when, shortly before or after the war. Shortly before the war, or maybe it was already war, around that time. But since they had their own apartment. But yeah, I did get some of the politics. And I do remember some events of course, you know, the Hakenkreuz and all the uniforms and whatever. And I do remember one incident, that was in 1938, when the Kristallnacht was in Munich, not only in Munich, in all the big cities, you know, when Jewish shops, the windows were smashed and the, what's the name of the temples there? The temples, I can't think of the proper name now.
Synagogue.
Huh?
Synagogue?
Synagogues. When the synagogues were ransacked, yes. I do remember that. I mean, we did not see or really see that because we lived on the edge of the city. We were not inside the city. But I do remember that my grandmother and my Tante Hella came and told my mother and my parents about it. And I also remember one incident when my father usually did not interfere with domestic issues. That was my mother's thing. But my mother worked in the office also half days. She had her own office with Frau Flaffenzeller and she worked there half the day. But usually he did not, you know, it was not his business. But he did come into the kitchen and I happened to be in the kitchen, so I overheard it. And he said to our maid and cook, Johanna, Johanna, you know, don't buy any more stuff from this and that shop, which was a Jewish shop, you know, where she went grocery shopping or something like that. And I don't remember the name of that shop, but I do remember that he told her not to shop there anymore. And at that time, you know, it didn't mean much to me, of course, but later it dawned to me that this was in 1938, when the, you know, at the time of the Kristallnacht or something.
And
so, and then of course, you know, we knew enough about politics. Well, we didn't know about politics, but you know what was going on in Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland annexation, and then Austria, that was in 1938, that's right, when Austria was joined to the Reich. That was done peacefully, so my father was called during the night because he had a car, you know, not everybody had a car, but he had a big carpentry and so on, and he needed a car. My mother had a car too. He had, I think, a BMW, and my mother had an Opel. And he was called to transport, I think, soldiers to the Austrian border, just, you know, for transportation. And that was before before Austria was joined with the Reich, and that was the big news. And shortly thereafter, there was something else, yes. You know, Austria was economically not as flourishing as Germany, and especially the big cities like Vienna. They had what we nowadays might call slums, you know, marginal housing, big families living in 2 rooms and all that. And as Germany had, when Germany had occupied Austria, from the big cities, this was organized by the NS, by the, you know, socialist
by the party
government, yeah, party. It was organized by the government. Children who were, you know, often undernourished or otherwise underprivileged were brought to the big cities, or also to smaller cities and so, and the population was encouraged to host them for 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 3 months, whatever, you know, to give them a break, to feed them, bring up their health. It was strictly, it was nothing political at all. It was just to, you know, give them a break, improve their health, and etc., etc. And my mother went there. There was a place in Munich, I don't know where, and she went there alone. And she says, you know, there were many children and people milling around and so. And then at the end, there were only a few children left. And one of those left was Hermine, and she was a girl. She was, how old was Hermine? I think 12 years at that time. And she had kind of blondish, straight hair. She wore glasses. She was undernourished. And she said another pair was there, a pair of girl twins, really nicely dressed and lively and so, and they were snatched up, you know, immediately, because they were, you know, good looking, even at that age, looks, you know, and charm. But Hermine was just sitting there, and so my mother took Hermine, you know, and she stayed with us not only 6 weeks, as was the original, you know, span of time. She was with us for several months, and she really, you know, she really had a good time. She enjoyed it. She did not have to go to school. These children, for some reason, did not have to go to school with us. So she was at home, and when we came home from school at noon, you know, we played together and did all things together. And she had even her own room, my father's private office, which also had a sofa, and that was made into a bed for Hermine. And when she came, you know, the first thing my mother did, she gave her a bath, because, you know, and so she told us, you know, she bathed Hermine, washed her hair, and when she showed her her bed, and so Hermine asked, oh, he said, all my room by myself. She could not believe she had a room of her own, because at home she had a number of brothers and sisters, and the whole family lived, I believe, in 2 rooms. You know, one room was kitchen and living room, and the other room, more or less, everybody slept, whatever, because after a couple of years, when my father was still alive, he visited them in Vienna, and, you know, my mother told us they had no real furniture. They were sitting on crates instead of chairs, because Hermine's father worked in the Großmarkthalle, in the central place in Vienna, where all the vegetables and everything comes together and is being distributed and so. And he was a worker there, and, you know, these crates were probably for nothing. They did not have the money to buy any furniture. They really were poor, you know. And she was undernourished, and she was a very well brought up child. She had manners, you know, please and thank you, and you know, she was a very pleasant child and a well brought up child in this respect. And well, when we were in school, she amused herself, and when we got home, we always played together, and she taught us some things which I still remember. You know, like rhymes to dance with, or to play with, warte mal, Kaiser, König, Edelmann, Bürger, Bauer, Bettelmann, Dings da, Leinenweber, Schuster, Schneider, Totengräber, Klein, Groß, Himmischlos, Hausbesitzer, Hausbesager, du verfluchter Zuckerbäcker. I still remember it. Hermine taught us that, and some, you know, some things to play with, or games and so. And even when she went home after a couple of months, of course, you know, Hermine was a couple of years older than I was. I was at that time 1938. I was, I think, 8 or 9 years old. And Hermine was not much taller than I was. But my mother bought her a new Lodenmantel, you know, the same kind of Loden coats that my brother and I wore to school, and she saw to it that Hermine had proper clothing in her size before she went home and all that. And we stayed in correspondence as long as we lived in Munich. And then after the war, we lost each other.
Oh, that's too bad.
Yeah. But no, not quite. That's not quite true. We did not lose each other during the war. We resumed that connection again after the war when we moved back to Munich. Well, anyway, so, but she, as I say, she was a well brought up and pleasant child, well mannered and so, but eventually she went back home again, and
Back to poor
back
situation.
to her poor, yeah. And as I said, my father was still alive then. My parents once on a trip to Vienna visited them, and they told us, about how they lived and all that. And of course her family was very happy to host my parents, and it was a big thing.